There's an extreme amount of hoopla and fear mongering that goes on with the name and term BlackRock. BlackRock conjures up in us, those of us who are online or associated to political, metapolitical stances and who are familiar with the way that finance interacts with politics, have heard the term BlackRock and ESG together to imply some sort of denigrating force. Now, there are a few factors at play here which go into the malevolence that is perceived as being, or at least stemming from, BlackRock because of their machinations when it comes to certain requirements around capital allocation. So for those who are maybe out of the loop, BlackRock is just an asset manager, which is a fancy way of saying that people send their money somewhere. Usually it's a bank, but it can be a pension fund or a superannuation fund. But some financial institution basically collects all the money from all these little people, $1,000 every month or whatever it is, from Tom, Dick, and Harry, and then starts to accumulate large piles of money. And they have to do something with that money because the expectation when you charge a fee for money is that you provide returns. This is the fee structured model around a lot of capital allocation vehicles, and particularly asset managers like BlackRock. And you can see here, taken from the financial performance, that the bulk of their revenue comes from investment advisory, administration fees, and securities lending revenue. They basically just charge a 1%, 0.1%, 0.5% fee on a certain ETF, exchange traded fund, or some other investment vehicle that you pay passively through the ownership. So they'll deduct the fee from your capital pool whilst providing you the returns that you would have experienced. So if it's in the S&P 500, if it's in all AI stocks, if it's in German bonds, whatever the mechanism or the instrument or the fund that you've invested into, will charge a fee for the whatever returns the makeup of the fund is allowing for. Now, this by itself is not pernicious, and it's not the nefarious underhanded tactics or anything. This is just the standard regulated way of understanding asset management as a both business, but also in the realm of financial allocation of capital. Now the problem becomes, and they'll show you why they've got such a negative association to their company, is because of the way that they started to, particularly in the 90s, associate certain capital allocation with ethical frameworks. So we wanted to see ethical companies rewarded and or unscrupulous or the less, we won't call them illegal because they're technically performing tasks legally. It's more like if there's some nefarious scheming going on and some underhanded dealings or black market activity, then we don't want to reward that. We won't allocate our funds into, say, something like HSBC, which is a bank which money laundered for the cartels. Then BlackRock would say, look, you've had this bad dealings. We're not going to associate with you. We're actually going to pull our capital from your stock pool. So when you buy certain amounts of stock, you start to accumulate shares. And when you have a certain amount of shares, you become a institutional stakeholder, basically shareholder. And you see most companies which are listed publicly have in the range of 0 to 15, 20% of their company owned by pension funds, superannuation funds, and these asset managers like BlackRock and Vanguard. But there's a bunch, JP Morgan, all of these banks, they all own massive asset management arms which just deploy capital passively into the market. Norwegian Investment Bank is a good one because the Sovereign Wealth Fund in Norway owns about 2% of all global stocks. So you can see how they start to accumulate a certain level of control, very, very minor, but also very, very major from a setting standards point of view. If you wanted people to conform, and you can throw money at conforming, then you can persuade them to do certain things that you want. Now, if you're not unreasonable, if you slightly nudge them in directions, this is much easier to swallow. So I'm capable of making decisions which don't necessarily harm me if it's a 50-50 judgment call and someone else says, look, if you do it this way, I'll actually allocate a bit more money to your firm. I'll give you a rating. I'll give you a score. And that score is a in my book, and that A gets a little bit more money or a little bit cheaper financing. Something around that is incentivizing you. And this is how these mechanisms work. So in and of itself, it's not necessarily a bad or good thing. It just is the way that the market interacts. The problem becomes, as I said before, when you start to inject political or ethical considerations into the social structure. So you say, look, it's not enough that your company does making widgets. It's that your company must make widgets with a framework like this, and you're not allowed to pollute, and you're not allowed to use this minerals from these regions, and you're not allowed to use this type of labor. There's structures around what is permissible and not. And this is where it becomes a more ethical call. This is the morality. If we're thinking about axiologically, what is the good and bad versions of capitalism? Well, now you have a judgment call, and this is usually based on asset managers' profiles. So they'll sit in the committee in the board meeting and say, look, we want to encourage this, or we want to discourage this. Here's how we're going to do that. We're going to suggest schema, and that's in relation to other bodies, and that could be anything from the WEF or the World Health Alliance or World Trade, whatever the body is internationally. Body will recommend things. The EU, for instance, can recommend certain things. Makes it easier for asset managers to align their principles with those of an existing structure, and will say, look, now there's an agreed upon framework that now everyone has to abide by. And you can see the incremental increase in these things allows for the cascade effect of what we would call over-politicalization of the financial realm, because you say, look, where does it stop? At what point does a government or a regulating body or a world organization tell me I can or cannot do things as a private business? Given that there's no legal structure around this, it's all elective, it's all free market, it's all capitalism, then theoretically I should be able to ignore it, which technically you can, but then also, as I said, comes with a cost. There's a punishment aspect to this. And this is where I think there's a negative force in the world that relates to places like BlackRock, because they become so large, such a behemoth. You can see that here. So $11 trillion of capital or assets under management. So for BlackRock, they're managing everyone else's money, and of that they're managing $11.5 billion worth of everyone else's money in some shape or form. Now, if you included like derivatives or underlyings, and they also have a lending, so if you short sell, they also do those sort of things. So I'm sure there's some way of calculating what the actual value is of an underlying asset or net asset value versus assets under management. But in any case, it's a bucket load of cash, like a prodigious amount of money here. And then you can see here that recently, because obviously there was such strong pushback from the Trump era, so starting in 2016-17, it was a bit of too much too quickly. So you can't boil a frog if you crank the heat up too much. And I think the neoliberal inclined ministers, policymakers, all of these international cabal of death merchants said, look, we want to make sure that I'm winning. Here's how I win. Institute these policies. Now, EU, you must obey. Now, we're going to set up global framework agreements, and all these governments, the people in governments who have nothing better to do, will sit together, come up and agree, and now there's governmental agreement, so it must be true, it must be legal, it must be the best modus operandi. But now in August last year, BlackRock basically stopped promoting these ESG policies. ESG is just environmental, social and governance, and they also had issues with SDR, which is the social development goals set by whoever stupid body that is. There's board politicians basically who are looking for sinecures after they've retired from active politics to something else. It's like NATO, handing out positions. It's fairly meaningless, and you consider it as a form of cronyism. You pat my back, I pat yours, and later on you'll be up for this promotion. And here's a nice salary to assuage you in the meantime. But here you can see that the current backing, so from July 23 to June of 24, the firm only, and this is BlackRock, backed 4% of 493 ESG proposals, which is down from 47% of the shareholder activist proposals that were supported in 2021. So such a precipitous decline only comes about if there is a material impact to the business, and people say, look, I'm actually going to take money out of BlackRock if you continue to do this. And so this is actually see where the chaos and confusion comes into play. You have finance guys who mock political guys, this is particularly on X, but on other platforms and forums, you go, finance guys laugh at the political guys and say, BlackRock, Vanguard, these are just funds, they don't have any of this stuff, all they do is deploy capital in these ways. ESG is just this spook where you're considering something nefarious is happening against you with these clandestine machinations behind closed doors. But what is the political guys' understanding is that no, everything is political in finance because it is so supremely political in the previous era up until about now, as tendrils seeped and were involved in almost every aspect of life, that this is just one more of those. You let this go, and then you've walked an extra step towards your own damnation. Now, the apotheosis here, I guess, is that we're seeing that rejection happen. That and I don't have it here. There's an outflow of, for instance, capital into BlackRock's environmental fund, I think it was, because the wholesale rejection of ESG also works from a financial perspective if you don't feel like the ESG policies are promoting shareholder value. And so this comes into another question around what is it exactly that financial asset managers, what should they be doing? This is owned by, or like it's a company, so it's run by a guy, I think Larry Fink, is it? It's run by a management team. These are people making decisions. This is not just some completely apolitical machine here which just deploys capital without thinking. It's people making decisions around how the company and strategy should work. A, they have a duty to their own shareholders, and B, they're trying to influence what is political decisions through finance. With the we're not influencing social. We're actually trying to benefit the earth. We're trying to reduce CO2. We're trying to prevent slavery. We're doing all these things that firms ostensibly are not equipped to do in ways that is, you could say, politically and for certain bias. So Spengler has an interesting quote here, which I think highlights this issue and how it comes about from a political perspective. He goes on to say, in Decline of the West, Marius, actually this is Hour of Decision. Marius, a political simpleton like so many popular leaders, and his backers Saturnus and Cinna, thought no differently from Cracus, and therefore Sulla, the dictator of the nationalist side, after the storming of Rome, organized a terrible butchery among the financiers, from which, as a class, they never recovered. After Caesar, they completely disappeared from history as a political element. Their existence as a political power was intimately bound up with the age of democratic party anarchy and did not survive it. So when you consider how politics engages with finance, or has historically, particularly in America, is that it is a promise machine. So the back end of politics in America is all money for things, these back dealings, pork barreling, things like this. How do I buy votes? How do I buy policies? It's been the case for about 150 years in America, maybe a bit longer. And in setting up such a sort of mechanism, you go down the route of once I'm used to getting something for money, then I habituate it. It becomes something that I necessarily have to keep doing it because I want to keep getting the things that I want. And then other businesses cotton onto this and they also want to do these things. This is why lobbying is so effective, obviously in America particularly, because you have a lot of money going any which way to promote certain things. And it's about the politician, how likable they are from a general perspective, because if they can be elected in their home constituency, then they'll be able to do whatever they want as long as they can appeal to those people on a continual basis, particularly for senators. So state senators, obviously having sometimes tenures of 30 years or more, engenders a certain amount of passivity in the voter base, particularly locally around, well, they're doing a fine job from my perspective, what more do I need to think about? Or at least I've heard their name or something. And this is how you get this status quo of finance and politics intermixing in this pre-Caesarian age. You can, in any democratic system, you can just pass on all the decision-making to the financiers and say, like, you tell me what to think, you're paying for my campaign, and they'll tell you what to think. This is not going to last, and we can see how that's possible because there's a wholesale rejection of finance as a source of, you could call it, political and social gunpowder. Once you've exhausted the efficacy of money, you've said, look, we've pumped endless amounts and trillions into certain things and nothing starts coming out. You're diminishing marginal returns here. Kamala Harris had however many billions pumped into her campaign and got nothing, zero, literally zero. So you also lose that aspect to it. The Romans were more militarized than the current society, so they chose to butcher their financiers. That won't happen in the West. Technocrats and particularly around the financial I don't want to call them cabal, but the financial backers of certain things will continue to exist, but they just take less and less importance because of the way that blood starts to flow to the forefront. So it goes into this question around, okay, if money starts to exhaust itself, what is the purpose of these funds now that they've shown that they're impotent around political decision-making because all they do is worsen the case for themselves? All they had to do was sit back, earn fee, and piss nobody off, but they couldn't help themselves, right? They had to accumulate all this wealth. They convinced themselves that wealth is, money is in particular, explicitly traded one-to-one for some political purpose. So if I have X amount of money, then I'm important, and this importance can be projected upon wider society in my own mind that's political favors that I'm purchasing with that dollars. Once that stops, it's what are you doing? Your business is supposed to be supporting shareholders rather than sponsoring political projects or backing random projects just because they survive your criteria assessment around an E or an S or a G. These are not coherent, and they're not also sustainable from a shareholder perspective. I don't want my money to retire being used for these malicious practices because you have, as I said before, ethical, and these business people think of themselves as very ethical, obviously, but in practice, what they're really doing is being legally required to do things. And this is not the same thing as ethics. So jurisprudence goes into this a lot as to what the actual ethical complications or implications are on certain laws. But it's particularly hazy and shady around business. It's very, very difficult to see through what the opaque requirements are for certain business decision making. Shareholder values, fairly easy to assess the impact or dimensions of, but there are others surrounding that which are less practical to analyze. So lastly, it becomes a question of what will we require of, because at some point a leader will come in and say, look, finance, you are not allowed to do any of these things anymore. You have no say, and you should not have any direction around what's allowed for another company that's on the stock market to be doing or not doing. You as a large conglomerate shareholder should not have any power whatsoever. You should be completely passive, and even your voting rights should probably be stripped because of the way that you start to understand the malicious intent that they've been devising and you can say diabolically scheming toward how they can control outcomes. And they'll at some point no longer be able to do that, say, the next 20 years. It takes a long time to do financial regulations, because of the way that America is structured. But and this is to say, the last thing is, if you want to have your money in a ETF or a savings account, you can actually choose. You can just go and see who owns whatever structured fund you're investing in and put your money more reasonably. I think one of those horrible politicians, Vivek, maybe had an idea about doing an anti-ESG fund or something where it's like, no, I'm going to do tobacco and weapons or something stupid, which is also just foolishness. And you can see that his puerile behavior has cost him what was probably a promising career in national politics. But the idea is much more around, like, I just want my money to make more money. That's it. That's the only function it should serve. I'm going to give it to the ones that manages it best. If that's some soulless school in a PE firm who's just trying to harness debt and leveraging X over X over X to earn more money, then that's much and far better than whatever notions of rectitude some BlackRock asset manager thinks he or she has. Your ownership on the moral landscape of finance interacting with politics should be over. And this is, I think, the ultimate, you could call, valence between finance and politics here. So if the finance bros and the political bros on X came together and both actually understood what the other side was complaining about or understood as the weaponization of finance, then I think you actually probably get to a congruence here around the outcomes being hopefully fairly depoliticized. I don't want certain things to have control, or certain companies' mechanisms to be in control of the way that I live my life. And if I ever start a company, then it shouldn't be at the whim of some mercy because it's on a public market of some out of shape 45-year-old who's bored with their life and is trying to tell me what to do. It just shouldn't be possible.